I still remember the way the wind sounded that night. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady enough to make the trees along the curb whisper to each other while the last cars pulled out of the recreation center parking lot. Most people had already gone home. The music was gone. The laughter was gone. Just scattered paper cups, folding tables waiting to be put away, and the feeling that another long day had finally ended. My phone buzzed as I was locking the side entrance. One message. From a number I didn't recognize. "Can you help me?" That was all it said. No name. No explanation. Just 5 words glowing against the dark screen. A minute later, another message arrived. "My daughter left her purse behind. She said you were the one who helped her earlier. Would you mind bringing it?" I looked down at the leather purse sitting on a folding chair beside me. I had noticed it almost an hour earlier and set it aside before anyone could accidentally walk off with it. I should have told security. I should have left it at the front desk. Instead, 20 minutes later, I was driving across town with the purse sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Funny how small decisions work. Most of the time, they disappear before you remember making them. Sometimes they don't. The address led me to a quiet neighborhood I rarely had a reason to visit. The houses weren't enormous. They were worse. They were the kind of homes that made you think someone had figured life out. Warm porch lights, clean walkways, flower beds that somehow looked perfect even in the dark. I parked at the curb and walked up the stone path. The air smelled faintly like fresh rain even though it hadn't rained all day. I raised my hand to knock. The door opened before my knuckles touched the wood. She was already standing there, waiting. A navy sweater, silver reading glasses resting in one hand. Calm eyes. The kind of calm that doesn't come from having an easy life. The kind that comes from surviving a difficult one. "You brought it yourself," she said. Her voice was warm without trying to be. I held up the purse. Figured it would get back to the right person faster. She smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the smile people use when they're trying to be nice. This one reached her eyes. "My daughter said you stayed until her ride arrived." I shrugged. It was late. For a second she studied me. Not my clothes. Not my truck parked by the curb. Not the fact that it was after 1 in the morning. Me. That's what caught me off guard. Most people look at circumstances first. She seemed to look past them. "That was kind of you," she said. I didn't know what to do with that. So I looked at the porch light instead. The glass around it was slightly fogged from the evening air. Anyone would have done the same thing. The smile returned. Smaller this time. Almost amused. "No," she said gently. "Not everyone would." Something about the way she said it made me think she knew exactly what she was talking about. The wind picked up behind me. I started to step backward. Well, I should probably get going. Instead of taking the purse and saying goodnight, she glanced toward the empty street and then back at me. "You're a long way from home." I laughed softly. "I guess I am." She opened the door a little wider. "Would you come inside for a cup of coffee?" Looking back, that should have felt strange. It didn't. Maybe because there was nothing reckless in her voice. No pressure. No awkwardness. Just an invitation. Simple. Ordinary. And somehow unexpected enough to stop me where I stood. I followed her into the house. The scent of coffee lingered somewhere in the air, even though none had been made yet. A lamp glowed softly beside a bookshelf. A blanket was folded neatly across the arm of a couch. The place felt lived in. Comfortable. Quiet. Like someone had built a life there one careful piece at a time. Then I noticed something else. A second coffee mug already sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting beside the machine, as if she'd decided to invite me in before I ever reached the front door. And, for reasons I couldn't explain then, that tiny detail stayed with me long after the night was over. Because what I didn't know yet was that this wasn't going to be a story about a lost purse, or a late-night cup of coffee. It was the beginning of something much harder to explain, and much harder to walk away from. The coffee was better than it had any right to be at 1:30 in the morning. Not because of the beans, not because of the machine, because of the silence around it. The comfortable kind. The kind that does not ask anything from you. She moved around the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had done the same routine 1,000 times. No wasted motion. No hurry. The soft glow above the counter caught strands of silver hidden among her blonde hair. Not enough to announce themselves, just enough to remind you that life leaves signatures on everyone. Cream? She asked. Black is fine. She nodded as if she had expected that answer. Funny thing about first impressions. Most people notice the obvious things. The house, the clothes, the neighborhood. What I noticed was that she listened carefully, not just to words, to pauses, to the spaces between them. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. Time felt different in that kitchen. Slower. She asked simple questions. How long had I lived in the area? Whether I liked my work. What I did when I was not working. Nothing invasive. Nothing uncomfortable. But somehow she learned more about me than people who had known me for years. At one point she looked toward the family room, where a lamp still glowed softly beside a bookshelf. My daughter worries me sometimes, she said. Not because she is irresponsible. Because she thinks she has to handle everything alone. I followed her gaze. There were framed photographs on a shelf. Vacations. Holidays. Birthdays. The usual collection of moments people try to preserve. I noticed something else. Every photograph included her daughter. Friends. Relatives. Different places. Different years. But the same two people appeared over and over. I did not ask about it. She did not explain it. Some questions belonged to later conversations. She is lucky you answered her message, she said. I smiled. I almost did not. But you did. There was something about the way she said that. As if the decision mattered more than it should have. When I finally stood to leave, the clock on the microwave read 2:07 a.m. She walked me to the front door. The night air felt colder than before. Thank you again, she said, for bringing the purse. You already thanked me. I know. Her smile returned. Small. Genuine. I still wanted to say it again. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that second coffee mug. The one already sitting on the counter before I arrived. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe she always kept two mugs there. But the thought stayed with me anyway. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. My phone sat on the kitchen table while I made breakfast. Eggs. Toast. Coffee. Nothing special. I was halfway through my second cup when the screen lit up. A text message. Hope you got home safely. That was all. No reason to send it. No obligation. Just a simple sentence. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I typed back. I did. Thank you for the coffee. A few minutes later, another message appeared. You are welcome. There was a pause. Then one more. My daughter says she never properly thanked you either. She would like me to pass that along. I laughed quietly to myself. Something about the formality of it felt oddly charming. The conversation ended there, at least for that day, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. The truth is, my life was not particularly exciting. Most days followed the same pattern. Work, home, dinner, sleep, repeat. There is nothing wrong with that kind of life. In fact, there is something peaceful about it. But peace can sometimes become loneliness if you are not careful. I learned that after my last relationship ended. Not all at once. Slowly. Like noticing a room getting darker after the sun goes down. There had been a time when I spent enormous amounts of energy trying to become whatever someone else needed. The strange part was how normal that felt while I was doing it. It was only afterward that I realized how exhausting it had been. Since then, I had become good at expecting very little. It kept disappointment manageable. That evening, just after sunset, another message arrived. This one came while I was cleaning up after dinner. I almost missed it. I hope this is not inappropriate, but I think I owe you another coffee. There was a smiling face at the end. Simple, harmless, and yet I found myself reading it twice. Then 3 times. Because the question was not whether I wanted coffee. The question was why someone like her seemed interested in seeing me again. And for the first time in a very long while, I was not entirely sure I knew the answer. I waited almost 10 minutes before answering her message. Not because I was busy, because I was trying to understand why I cared about getting the response right. That alone should have told me something. Most people move through your life like weather. They arrive. They leave. A few leave an impression. Very few make you pause in your own kitchen while staring at a screen. I finally typed that coffee sounded like a good idea. Her reply came less than a minute later. Friday afternoon? There was something strangely reassuring about that. No games. No mystery. Just a straightforward invitation. Friday arrived with one of those bright autumn afternoons that made everything look sharper than usual. The sky seemed bigger. The sunlight seemed cleaner. When I pulled into the small cafe she had suggested, I saw her before she saw me. She was sitting near the front window reading from a thick hardcover book. A cup of tea sat untouched beside her. What struck me was not how she looked. It was how completely present she seemed. Most people spend their time waiting for something else to happen. She looked perfectly comfortable exactly where she was. When she noticed me approaching, she closed the book immediately and smiled. Not because she had finished the page, because she did not want me walking up to an unopened conversation. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people would never notice. I did. We spent almost 2 hours talking. Nothing important. Everything important. The conversation drifted naturally from one subject to another. Books, travel, favorite restaurants, childhood memories, the strange habits people collect over the years. At one point I mentioned that I preferred old hardware stores to giant chain stores. Most people would have ignored the comment. She asked why. I told her there was something reassuring about places where the owner knew every shelf by memory. She nodded as if the answer made perfect sense. Later she mentioned how much she liked handwritten grocery lists because they felt more intentional than phone notes. Neither topic mattered, and somehow both did. When we finally stood to leave, she thanked me for coming as if I had done her a favor. On the drive home, I realized something unusual. I felt lighter. Not excited. Not overwhelmed. Just lighter. Like I had spent 2 hours carrying less weight than usual. The following week, I did not hear from her for several days. I told myself that was normal. Healthy, even. Then Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed again. I smiled before I read the message. That realization irritated me slightly. My reaction arrived before my logic. There is something embarrassing about discovering your emotions have already made a decision. The message itself was simple. I am trying to move a bookshelf and beginning to regret buying it. Any chance you have advice? I laughed out loud. Advice. Not help. Advice. The distinction felt deliberate. I called instead of texting back. How large is the bookshelf? I asked. Large enough to make poor life choices feel very real. That sounds serious. I thought so too. 20 minutes later, I was in my truck heading toward her house. The bookshelf turned out to be exactly what I expected. Solid oak. Heavy enough to require 2 people. We managed to move it into place after several attempts and more laughter than either of us expected. Once it was finished, she stepped back and folded her arms. That looks much better. It does. She tilted her head slightly. You knew that before we moved it. Probably. Then why did you not tell me? Because you would have moved it anyway. She stared at me for a second before laughing. A real laugh. The kind that arrives unexpectedly. Later, while she made coffee, I noticed something sitting on a shelf nearby. A small notebook. Dark blue cover. Corners worn from use. Earlier in the cafe, she had mentioned keeping track of books she wanted to read. Now I realized she still carried the notebook instead of using an app. Most people would have forgotten that detail. I had not. When she returned with 2 mugs, she set mine down without asking how I took my coffee. Black. Exactly the way I drank it. I looked at the cup, then at her. She noticed. You remembered, I said. Of course. She said it so casually that it almost sounded obvious. Then she took a sip from her own mug and glanced out the kitchen window. People tell you things all the time, she said quietly. Most of us just do not listen carefully enough. I do not know why that stayed with me. Maybe because she was right. Or maybe because I had the growing suspicion that she listened more carefully than anyone I had ever met. Before I left that evening, she walked me to the front door again. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. As I stepped outside, she hesitated. Just briefly. Then she said, "There is a charity reception next week. I normally attend alone. Would you consider coming with me?" I looked back at her. Something in her expression suggested the question mattered more than she was letting on. And for the first time since we met, I found myself wondering not why she kept inviting me into her world. I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. For the next 3 days, I thought about saying no. Not because I did not want to go, because I was not sure I belonged there. There is a difference. One is preference. The other is fear disguised as practicality. By the time the evening arrived, I had almost convinced myself that attending was a mistake. The building hosting the reception sat downtown between two restored historic properties. Valet attendants moved efficiently beneath strings of warm lights. Large windows spilled golden light onto the sidewalk. Everything looked polished, intentional, expensive. I parked 3 blocks away instead. Old habits die hard. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the noise. Not loud noise. Successful noise. Conversations about investments, foundations, projects, vacations. The kind of conversations that seemed to assume everyone in the room belonged there. I immediately felt like someone who had accidentally wandered into the wrong event. Then I saw her. She was standing near the center of the room, speaking with 2 older gentlemen in dark suits. The moment she spotted me, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of smile people save for someone they are genuinely happy to see. She excused herself before either conversation was finished and walked directly toward me. "You came." I said I would. "That does not always mean people will." I laughed softly. "That sounds like experience talking." Unfortunately, for reasons I could not explain, the tension in my shoulders eased almost immediately. She had a gift for doing that, making difficult things feel manageable. She introduced me to several people over the next hour. Board members, business owners, community leaders. Every introduction sounded roughly the same. "This is Grant. He is a friend." Every time she used that word, I found myself paying attention to it. Friend. Simple word. Comfortable word. Yet somehow it mattered. The room itself felt like a different world from mine. Crystal glasses. Catered food. Conversations about things I knew very little about. More than once I caught myself wondering what exactly I was doing there. At one point, I drifted toward a quieter hallway lined with framed photographs from previous charity projects. I needed a minute. Just a minute. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Much easier to understand than the ballroom. I was studying a photograph when a familiar voice appeared beside me. "I had a feeling I would find you hiding." I turned. She was smiling. "I am not hiding." "Of course not. I am appreciating the photography." Naturally, I could hear the amusement in her voice. We stood together looking at the display for a moment. Then she became quiet. "You look uncomfortable." Most people would have pretended not to notice. She never seemed interested in pretending. "A little. Because of the event." I nodded. "Everyone here seems to know exactly what they are doing. Most of them are improvising." "I doubt that. Trust me." She folded her arms lightly. "Confidence and certainty are not the same thing." I looked back toward the ballroom. "Still feels like I do not fit." Her eyes followed mine. Then she said something I would remember long after the evening ended. "You spend your life making things work that other people depend on." I shrugged. "That is just my job." "No." Her voice remained calm. "That is who you are." For a second I did not know what to say. The strange thing was not the compliment. It was the accuracy. Most people noticed what someone did. She noticed why they did it. Before I could respond, another guest approached and greeted her enthusiastically. The conversation quickly shifted toward fundraising goals and upcoming projects. I stepped back, giving her space. It seemed like the appropriate thing to do. From across the room, I watched her move effortlessly between conversations. She listened carefully, remembered details, made people feel important. It became obvious why so many people respected her. Yet something else caught my attention. Every few minutes her eyes searched the room. Not constantly, not obviously, just enough. And more often than not, they landed on me. Later that evening, after the speeches ended and guests began gathering near the exits, I found myself standing alone beside one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights. A man I had met earlier approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You know," he said casually, handing me one. I have known her for almost 10 years. I smiled politely. She seems like someone people remember. She is. He glanced across the room toward her. What surprises me is that she invited you. The comment caught me off guard. Why? He studied me for a moment as though deciding how much to say. Then he smiled. Because she usually keeps her personal life separate from everything else. Before I could ask what he meant, someone called his name from across the room. He excused himself and disappeared into the crowd. I looked back toward her. She was laughing at something another guest had said. Yet for the first time since meeting her, a question settled heavily in my mind. Maybe the real mystery was not why she kept inviting me into her world. Maybe it was why she had decided to make room for me there at all. The conversation with the man at the reception stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because of what he said, because of how casually he said it. As if it were obvious. As if everyone except me already understood something I had not figured out yet. For the next week, life returned to its usual rhythm. Work orders, maintenance schedules, long drives between properties, the familiar comfort of solving problems that had clear solutions. A faulty irrigation valve either worked or it did not. A damaged control panel either needed repair or replacement. Real life was usually less cooperative. Yet somehow, she kept finding her way into my days. Sometimes it was a text message asking whether I had ever read a particular book. Sometimes it was a photograph of a bakery she thought I might like. Once it was simply a picture of a sunset with the message, "This seemed like something you would stop and appreciate." The strange thing was that she was right. I would have. A few days later she invited me over for dinner. Nothing formal. Nothing elaborate. She described it as an experiment involving a recipe she was not entirely convinced would succeed. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something different. Usually her house felt perfectly organized. Everything in its place. Everything under control. This time there were papers spread across the dining table. Several folders sat open beside a laptop. A legal pad covered in handwritten notes rested near an empty coffee cup. She saw me looking and smiled apologetically. "Ignore the chaos." "This is your version of chaos?" I asked. "You should see my office. I am beginning to suspect your standards are unrealistic." That earned a laugh. While she finished preparing dinner, I helped clear the table. The papers revealed fragments of a life I rarely saw. Project budgets, community programs, meeting schedules, deadlines, responsibilities, more responsibilities. The deeper truth arrived quietly. She carried a tremendous amount of weight every day. Most people probably assumed she handled it effortlessly. Standing there, stacking folders into neat piles, I realized effortlessness was an illusion. During dinner, our conversation drifted toward work. Not my work, hers. For the first time since we met, she spoke honestly about how exhausted she sometimes felt. Not physically, emotionally. "Everyone brings me problems," she said with a small smile. "I know that sounds ungrateful. It does not. Most days I am happy to help. But sometimes I look at my phone and hope nobody needs anything for just one evening." There was no self-pity in her voice. Just honesty. The kind that usually arrives when someone trusts you enough to stop pretending. I noticed she barely touched her meal while talking. I noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes. I noticed she rubbed the bridge of her nose twice when discussing an upcoming project. Small things. Easy to miss. Impossible to ignore once you saw them. After dinner, we carried our coffee outside to the back patio. The evening air had turned cool. A soft breeze moved through the trees beyond the fence. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Surprisingly, the silence felt comfortable. Then she said something so quietly I almost missed it. "Do you know what I like about being around you?" I looked over. "What?" She stared into her coffee cup for a moment before answering. "I never feel like I have to perform." I did not respond immediately, partly because I was not sure what to say, partly because the statement felt more important than she intended it to sound. "Most people expect something," she continued. "Advice, decisions, solutions, leadership." She smiled faintly. "You just show up." The compliment hit harder than it should have. Maybe because nobody had ever described me that way before. Or maybe because she made it sound valuable. We sat there for another hour talking about ordinary things. Movies, favorite places to travel, foods we pretended not to like as children. Yet beneath every conversation was the growing sense that something deeper was happening. Not romance. Not yet. Something quieter. Trust. Before I left, she walked me to the front door as she always did. Halfway there, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and sighed almost imperceptibly. Not annoyance. Fatigue. The kind that settles into a person after carrying too much for too long. She answered briefly, solved whatever problem had appeared, and ended the call. Then she looked at me and laughed softly. See what I mean? You never really get a night off. Not often. There was a pause. A small one. Then she looked directly at me. Sometimes I think you are the only person who notices when I am tired. The words lingered between us. More personal than anything we had said before. More revealing than she probably realized. On the drive home, I found myself thinking less about what she had said and more about what she had not. Because for the first time since meeting her, I had seen a crack in the carefully constructed image everyone else seemed to admire. And once I noticed it, I could not stop wondering how long she had been carrying all of it alone. After that evening, something shifted without either of us talking about it. The messages became more frequent, but not in a way that felt forced. Sometimes she would send a photograph of a bookstore window she had passed on her lunch break. Sometimes I would send a picture of a sunrise over a greenhouse roof before the workday started. None of it seemed important on its own. Together, it began to feel like a conversation that never completely stopped. A few weeks earlier, if my phone buzzed during dinner, I usually ignored it until later. Now I found myself glancing toward it almost immediately. That realization was uncomfortable. Not because I disliked it, because I had spent years building a life that expected very little from anyone. Expectations have a way of creating disappointment. At least that was what I used to believe. One Tuesday afternoon, I was finishing a maintenance inspection nearly 40 miles outside town when my phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen. She almost always texted, very rarely called. Something about that alone made me answer before the second ring. Hey. There was a brief pause. I hope I am not interrupting anything. Her voice sounded different. Not panicked. Not upset. Just tired. More tired than usual. I looked out across the rows of equipment in front of me. You are not interrupting anything important. Another pause. Would you happen to be busy this evening? I smiled slightly. That depends on what you are about to ask. I heard a quiet laugh. Small. Relieved. I have been staring at the same problem for 6 hours, and I am officially out of ideas. What kind of problem? The kind that probably is not actually a problem. Those are usually the worst ones. Exactly. For some reason that made her laugh again. A real laugh this time. When I arrived at her house later that evening, I discovered the crisis involved neither business nor paperwork. It was a guest room she had been trying to reorganize. Books stacked on the floor. Storage boxes half unpacked. Shelves waiting to be assembled. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I realized that was not why she had called. We spent the next hour sorting through boxes. Every now and then she would hold up an item and tell a story attached to it. An old travel guide from a trip years ago. A framed photograph from a volunteer project. A collection of handwritten recipe cards passed down through her family. The room slowly became more organized. But what stayed with me was something else. For the first time, she seemed willing to let me see the unfinished parts of her life. Not the polished version everyone else saw. The real version. The one with cluttered closets and postponed projects and moments of uncertainty. At one point, she sat cross-legged on the floor holding a small cardboard box filled with old photographs. Her shoulders relaxed in a way I had never noticed before. You know something? She asked. What? She studied one of the photographs for a second. I almost did not call you. Why? Because it felt silly. I shrugged. It was shelves. Not open heart surgery. Exactly. She smiled. Then her expression softened. Most people in my life only call when they need answers. The room grew quiet. I waited. Eventually, she continued. I realized today that I wanted to spend time with someone who was not asking anything from me. The words settled between us. Simple, honest, difficult to forget. We finished organizing the room shortly after sunset. By then the shelves were assembled, the boxes were sorted, and the guest room looked completely different. She stood in the doorway studying the result. That feels better. It does. You know the funny part? What? She folded her arms lightly. I could have hired someone to do this weeks ago. I suspected that. Then why did you come? I looked around the room, then back at her. Because you asked. For a second, neither of us spoke. Something changed in her expression. Not surprise. Not exactly. More like recognition. As if I had confirmed. Something she had already been wondering about. Later we sat on the back patio with coffee while the evening settled around us. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of sprinklers turning on somewhere down the street. She stared out into the darkness beyond the yard. Do you know what is strange? She asked. Probably. She smiled without looking at me. When something good happens, everyone wants to celebrate with you. That sounds accurate. But when you are tired, she stopped for a moment. When you are really tired, you find out how few people notice. I looked down at my coffee, then back at her. I notice. The words left my mouth before I had time to reconsider them. She turned toward me. For a second, neither of us looked away. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile. Not the public smile. Something quieter. Something real. I know, she said softly. On the drive home that night, I realized something I had not been willing to admit before. If my phone rang tomorrow and her name appeared on the screen, I would answer without hesitation. And the part that unsettled me most was how natural that it started to feel. The first sign that something was changing was not dramatic. It was the absence of a message. 3 days passed without hearing from her. Under normal circumstances, I would not have noticed. People get busy. Lives move in different directions. Conversations pause. That is how adulthood works. At least that is what I told myself on the first day. By the second day, I found myself glancing at my phone more often than usual. By the third day, I was irritated by how much I cared. The feeling reminded me of something I had not experienced in a long time. Not loneliness. Anticipation. And anticipation can be dangerous when you have spent years convincing yourself not to expect much from anyone. Thursday afternoon arrived with gray skies and steady rain. I was finishing paperwork at a small service office when my phone vibrated. For a split second, I expected her name. It was not. The message came from someone I had not heard from in nearly 8 months. Lauren. Just seeing the name made my shoulders tighten. Some people leave your life quietly. Others leave echoes. She belonged to the second category. The message itself was harmless. Hope you are doing well. It has been a while. That was all. No explanation. No context. Yet I knew exactly what it was. Some people do not return because they miss you. They return because they miss access to you. I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone and setting it face down on the desk. The strange thing was that I did not feel the same anxiety I would have felt a year earlier. There had been a time when a message from her could derail an entire week. Now it mostly felt like opening a book I no longer wanted to read. That realization should have made me happy. Instead, it left me thoughtful. Because growth rarely announces itself while it is happening. You only recognize it later. That evening, I finally heard from Diane. The message was simple. Sorry I disappeared. Busy week. I smiled before I could stop myself. Then another message appeared. Coffee tomorrow? I answered almost immediately. The next afternoon, we met at a small cafe near the edge of town. The weather had improved. Sunlight reflected off puddles left behind by the rain. When I walked inside, she was already there. But something felt different. Not wrong, just quieter. The moment I sat down, I noticed the faint exhaustion around her eyes. The way she wrapped both hands around her cup as if borrowing warmth from it. The way she looked out the window before speaking. Long week? I asked. She laughed softly. That obvious? A little. I was hoping I looked mysterious. You look tired. She smiled at that. Not offended. Almost relieved. For a few seconds, she stared into her coffee. Then she shook her head. I think I am getting bad at pretending everything is fine. Maybe you are getting tired of pretending." The words slipped out before I had time to filter them. She looked at me for a moment, then slowly nodded. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Yet I sensed a new honesty in the conversation, as if some invisible wall had become thinner. At one point she admitted she had been working late every night, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to 3 different people, solving problems that never seemed to end. "Everyone assumes I can handle everything," she said. "Can you?" She smiled faintly. "Usually." That was not the question. Her smile disappeared. "Not completely. Just enough." "No," she said quietly. "Not always." That answer stayed with me, because it was the first time she had allowed herself to say it out loud. When we finally left the cafe, we walked toward our vehicles together. The afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the parking lot. She stopped beside her car and looked at me. "Thank you." "For what?" "For listening." I almost laughed. It seemed like such a small thing. Then again, maybe it was not. Maybe being heard mattered more than most people realized. She opened the driver's side door, then hesitated. "You know something?" she said. "What?" A thoughtful expression crossed her face. "Lately, whenever something happens, you are the first person I think about calling." The statement landed harder than any compliment ever could. Before I could respond, she offered a small smile and climbed into the car. I stood there watching her drive away. And for the first time since all of this began, a thought appeared that I was not ready to examine too closely. Because if she had become the first person I wanted to hear from each day, and I had become the first person she wanted to call, then whatever existed between us was no longer simple friendship. The only question was whether either of us was ready to admit it. For the next several days, I tried not to think too much about what she had said in the parking lot. That strategy lasted approximately 6 hours. The truth was simple. Once certain thoughts enter your mind, they do not politely leave because you ask them to. They settle in. They wait. They become part of the background noise of your day. I found myself replaying small moments instead. The second coffee mug waiting on the counter that first night. The way she remembered how I took my coffee. The way she noticed when I was uncomfortable at the reception before I said a word. The way she seemed to listen to everything. Not just the important things. The little things. The things most people forgot 5 minutes later. Looking back, the signs had been there all along. I just had not known what to call them. One Saturday morning, I was replacing a damaged irrigation controller when my phone buzzed. A message from Diane. No greeting. No explanation. Just a photograph. I stared at the screen for a second before smiling. It was a picture of a small independent bookstore. In the window sat a first edition copy of a novel I had mentioned months earlier during one of our conversations. Beneath the photo, she had written 3 words. "Thought of you." That was it. 3 words. Yet they followed me for the rest of the day. Because the older I got, the more I realized that caring was usually visible in details. Grand gestures were memorable. Small observations were personal. Late that afternoon, I stopped by the bookstore on my way home. The book was gone by the time I arrived. I sent her a message telling her she had excellent timing. Her reply came almost immediately. "I bought it." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. "I was hoping to give it to you myself." The following evening, she invited me over for dinner again. The weather had turned cooler. The first signs of winter were beginning to appear around town. Leaves gathered along curbs. Porch lights came on earlier each evening. The world seemed quieter somehow. When I arrived, she opened the door holding the book. "I believe this belongs to you," she said. I accepted it carefully. "You did not have to do this." "I know." Her answer was immediate. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just honest. During dinner we talked about everything except the obvious thing neither of us seemed ready to discuss. Yet the atmosphere felt different. Softer. Less guarded. At one point her daughter stopped by briefly to drop something off. Watching them interact revealed another side of Diane. She was still thoughtful. Still composed. But there was warmth there too. An ease that appeared whenever she forgot to be responsible for everyone else. After her daughter left, The house became quiet again. We moved into the living room with coffee. A fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace. Not because it was especially cold, because it made the room feel comfortable. We sat there talking while shadows moved across the walls. At some point, the conversation drifted toward relationships. Not ours. Relationships in general. The mistakes people make. The things they learn too late. I used to think love was supposed to be exciting all the time, I admitted. She looked down at her cup. And now, I thought about it for a moment. Now I think peace is underrated. A slow smile appeared. Not surprised. Almost relieved. I was hoping you would say something like that. The room grew quiet. Not awkward. Just thoughtful. Then she set her coffee down and looked directly at me. Can I tell you something? Of course. She hesitated for only a second. When we first met, I noticed how carefully you treated people when you thought nobody was paying attention. I did not know what to say. She continued before I could respond. Most people are kind when it benefits them. You are kind because it never occurs to you not to be. For a moment, the only sound in the room came from the fireplace. The strange thing was not hearing the words. It was realizing how much they mattered. Because for years I had measured my worth through accomplishments, through usefulness, through whether I could solve problems. Diane seemed to value entirely different things. Things I had never thought to count. When I finally left that night, she walked me to the door as always. The cold air rushed in when she opened it. Neither of us moved immediately. Then she smiled. Softly. Drive safely, Grant. Such a simple sentence. Yet as I walked toward my truck, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped looking forward to seeing her. I had started missing her before I even left. And for the first time, that truth no longer felt frightening. It felt honest. Winter arrived gradually after that. Not with a storm. Not with a dramatic change. Just colder mornings. Earlier sunsets. The quiet transformation that happens when a season decides it has stayed hidden long enough. Life continued moving forward, but something fundamental had changed inside me. I no longer measured my days the way I once had. There was a time when finishing projects, solving problems, and checking tasks off a list felt like enough. Now I found myself looking forward to smaller things. A message from Diane. A conversation over coffee. The familiar sight of her front porch light glowing in the evening. One Saturday afternoon, she invited me over for lunch. Nothing unusual about that. We had shared plenty of meals by then. Yet something felt different the moment I arrived. The house was quiet, comfortable, familiar, the kind of place where I no longer felt like a guest. While she finished preparing lunch, I found myself setting plates on the table without being asked, refilling water glasses, opening cabinets because I already knew where things were. Halfway through the meal, I realized what I was doing and almost laughed. Somewhere along the way, her home had stopped feeling unfamiliar. After lunch, we sat in the living room while soft winter sunlight filtered through the windows. A fire burned quietly in the fireplace. Neither of us seemed in any hurry to be anywhere else. Diane was reading through a stack of notes for an upcoming project. I was pretending to read a book while mostly watching her over the top of the pages. At one point, she looked up and caught me. You have not turned that page in 10 minutes. I am reading slowly. You are terrible at lying. I smiled. She smiled back. Then something softened in her expression. The room grew quiet again. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just honest. Finally, she set her papers aside. Can I tell you something? She asked. The question sounded familiar. Important conversations often began that way between us. Of course. She folded her hands together and looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. Do you remember the night you brought the purse back? I nodded. I remember. A small smile appeared. I knew almost immediately that you were different. I started to protest. She raised a hand gently. Let me finish. Her voice carried the calm confidence I had come to know so well. People spend a lot of time trying to impress each other. They talk about success, accomplishments, status. They try to show you who they are. She paused. You never did. I said nothing. She continued. You showed me who you were without realizing anyone was paying attention. The fire crackled softly nearby. Outside, a light breeze moved through the bare branches beyond the windows. "Do you know what I noticed first?" she asked. I shook my head. "It was not that you helped someone." Her smile deepened slightly. "Lots of people help when it is convenient. I noticed how carefully you treated people when there was nothing to gain from it." For a second, I could not find the right response. Not because I disagreed. Because nobody had ever described me that way before. Diane leaned back against the couch. "The more I got to know you, the more certain I became." Certain about what? Her eyes held mine. Warm, steady, unafraid. That being around you felt like coming home after a long day. The words settled somewhere deep inside me. For years I had carried a belief I rarely admitted out loud. A belief that I was useful but forgettable, reliable but temporary. The person people appreciated while he was helping and forgot when he was gone. Diane had spent months quietly dismantling that belief piece by piece. Not through speeches, not through promises, through attention, through consistency, through seeing things in me that I had stopped seeing in myself. I looked down briefly before answering. "You know something?" "What?" My voice came out softer than I expected. For a long time I thought being chosen was something other people experienced. Her expression changed. Immediately. Not surprise. Understanding. The kind that arrives when someone finally says something they have been carrying for years. "Grant," she said gently, "I have been choosing you for a very long time." The room fell silent. Yet somehow it felt fuller than any conversation we had ever shared. Suddenly dozens of moments made sense. The messages, the invitations, the remembered details, the second coffee mug waiting on the counter that first night. All the small choices that had seemed insignificant on their own. They had never been insignificant. They had been answers. I simply had not known the questions yet. Later that evening we stood together on the back patio, watching the last light disappear beyond the trees. The air was cold enough to see our breath. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We did not need to. Peace has its own language. Eventually Diane slipped her arm through mine and rested her head lightly against my shoulder. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just simple certainty. The kind built slowly. Earned patiently. Protected carefully. Looking back now, I think that was the moment everything truly settled into place. Not because our lives suddenly became perfect. They did not. Problems still appeared. Responsibilities still existed. Difficult days still happened. But neither of us carried them alone anymore. And maybe that was the real ending. Not finding someone who erased loneliness forever. Finding someone who made loneliness feel smaller every time they walked into the room. These days, whenever people ask how our story began, I usually smile and tell them it started with a forgotten purse. That answer is technically true, but it leaves out the important part. The important part is that somewhere between ordinary conversations, shared coffee, quiet evenings, and countless small acts of kindness, two people discovered they had become home for each other. And after spending so much of my life feeling temporary, there is no gift greater than finally knowing where you belong.